We're recording.
Good morning, everyone. This is the meeting of the Boulder County Commissioners. It is April 22nd, Earth Day 2021. All three commissioners are present, and we are here for a public meeting to discuss the racial equity and inclusion from the Community Planning and Zoning group from CPP, excuse me. So whoever wants to take it away, please take it away.
Good morning, Commissioners. Happy Earth Day. I'm Dale Case. I'm the Director of Community Planning and Permitting. And I thank you for helping us engage in this important discussion as we continue to move forward on centering our planning and programming efforts on race and equity. This is a condensed version. It might not seem like it to you when we're done, of a presentation we did to Planning Commission last September. It was very well received by them, and it sparked a good amount of interest amongst our 9 members on the Planning Commission and a desire for them to keep following up and move forward to address these issues. To understand the issues, it is important to have an understanding of our past. Understanding the implications of past decisions will help us build a more inclusive and complete community as we plan Boulder County. And Angel, if you can share your screen with the slides, that would be great. Oops. So before turning this over to the team, an amazing group of people who have worked hard to put this together, including a number of other people who you will not hear directly from today, but also put in a significant amount of work along with the entire staff at CPNP, members of public health, input from Parks and Open Space staff. So it's really been really rewarding discussions that helped us get to this place. I will start by giving a quick overview of the planner's role and our county's commitment to inclusion. Then the team will provide a historic context to planning and development in the county. We acknowledge the topic can be difficult and sometimes uncomfortable. The county's experience on how systemic racism has impacted our development pattern and equitable opportunities is not unique. Discriminatory practices are unfortunately woven throughout the history of US development. You can see this through the resource list that was part of the agenda packet. And there's sadly so many other examples, and you'll also hear a number of those today as we go through this presentation. As staff has taken time to discuss this topic, it has been interesting to hear and understand the different perspectives and experiences. It has helped shape my understanding, and for that, I'm appreciative. As we continue, we hope to hear from you and the community in an open dialogue. Your ideas, questions, and perspectives on the subject will make for a richer process. This presentation is not an indictment of all our past planning decisions. There are many positive and essential outcomes to past decisions and to zoning in general. We've got successful environmental stewardship and environmental protections on habitat. We help protect public health. We've improved water quality. Our compact urban form helps preserve local ag lands for local food, our open spaces for wildlife and recreation. Our compact urban form helps lower infrastructure costs and makes transit and redevelopment options possible. And our continued efforts to develop affordable housing have had numerous successes. But because not all these decisions were made through an equity lens, there are impacts in how we have allocated our resources, addressed our housing issues, addressed mobility impacts, and other intended and non-intended consequences, which all have impacted equity and inclusion in our communities. There will be opportunities through the presentation for you to reflect and ask questions. And then we hope to have a discussion at the end to help direct us to topics or items you may want to explore. We are most interested in ideas for actions that we can take to further embed racial equity and your ideas for broadening the conversations to hear from the community on impacts they face based on our planning decisions. So we'll jump in here, a little bit of history. There are many different theories circulating about how we plan our communities. Equity and advocacy are not a new concept in the planning world. Advocacy and equity planning go back over 60 years with Paul Davidoff on advocacy planning and Norm Krumholtz on equity planning. I was fortunate to have Norm as a professor in grad school at Cleveland State University. His planning class was very different from my other planning classes. We learned and discussed a planner's role in a different context from the technical planner, the site planning, the physical planning. We learned about the planner as the advocate as opposed to the technocrat. The planner as an expert as opposed to the technocrat. A voice for those who might not have a seat at the table. A coalition builder. And one that recognizes and represents the entire community and those neighborhoods that are being left behind. This class and Norm were a building block for me and so many other planners, and things that I've taken into my professional life. And I know my fellow planners who have come from other education and backgrounds also share these same passions. But why is it so hard? Because planners, we work on messy problems. There are not clear outcomes. We deal with the unknown. We deal with a host of other interests, a host of other people, sister agencies, civic groups, businesses, public, etc. Each bringing and representing their values. We often say we balance competing interests. I think what this presentation will illuminate, however, is that there can't be balance when the competition isn't fair. There are groups that have a stake in the outcome, but they aren't present at the competition. In addition, a discussion around balance generally assumes a this or that outcome. We know issues are much more complex with many inputs, players, and potential outcomes. Our job is to recognize and act on this disparity. The American Planning Association Planning for Equity Policy Guide recognizes the need for the heightened awareness around equity and recommends weaving equity throughout policies through utilizing an equity lens, much like planners have been doing with public health over the last 10, 15, 20 years, weaving public health throughout all our policies and procedures. Can go to the next slide, please, Angel. As planners, we follow and greatly appreciate a strong ethical underpinning. We live by a code of ethics. The code of ethics of the American Institute of Certified Planners follows and recognizes the planner's role in furthering equity and inclusion in our communities. Part A of the code is aspirational. And if you can click again, Angel, I think it'll bring up highlighting on E and F. E gets to the point of engagement, and people should have the opportunity to have meaningful impact. And we have a responsibility to include those that don't have formal organization or influence. And still, while aspirational in nature, the language in F is on point and directive. We shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and to promote racial and economic integration. We shall urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions that oppose such needs. This is strong language, and it helps to illuminate our role as planners in the community. Next slide, please. The county also has strong language and a strong effort towards equity and inclusion. Internally, county, we have adopted the county's strategic priorities. These are 5 priority areas adopted by the commissioners to help provide leadership direction to county operations. They were developed using community input and feedback via the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan, the Regional Affordable Housing Plan, the Public Health Improvement Process, Transportation Master Plan, Parks and Open Space Visitation 2020, and the Sustainability Plan, among other planning efforts. The priorities help focus the organization. Next slide, please. If you review the document, you will see equity as a key principle underlying the implementation of each of the priorities. Then the specific priority areas reinforce the equity focus and drive us to action. There are the priority areas, including affordable living, climate action, equity, and justice. The equity work this team you're seeing today, the department and others around the county, aligns with these priorities. Next slide, please. The Boulder County Comprehensive Plan addresses equity in our guiding principles. A few of those guiding principles are pulled out here on this slide. The comprehensive plan and our implementing regulations are opportunities to further evolve these guiding principles by developing policies to move forward on racial equity. A few examples of other jurisdictions that have developed equity-based plans include Seattle, Portland, and Montgomery County, Maryland. Montgomery County has developed and utilizes a racial equity lens now as they review development and transportation projects. So some ideas for how we can move some of these ideas into action. We know planning has positive outcomes, as noted earlier, but as we note, additional focus on equity is necessary. Our Boulder County communities are taking action to include inclusionary zoning requirements and build programs to help meet the community's housing needs. But the question remains, when we review a specific project, is how do we get past some of the common refrains we hear, such as, I fully support affordable housing, this just isn't the right location. We also commonly hear, you can't build your way out of this. But we should also hear is, we cannot not build ourselves out of it. The solutions are complex and multi-layered. We know just building more is not a solution unto itself. Building more with supporting inclusionary policies and recognizing all the costs associated with living, transportation, health, the environment, time, equity, and others will make for a better community. The Regional Housing Plan and community's efforts to achieve 12% affordable housing is very promising. Boulder, Longmont, and now Superior have all adopted inclusionary zoning. The Erie staff is looking at proposing inclusionary zoning as well. There are new county housing authority projects in the last several years in Nederland, Longmont, Louisville, and Lafayette are helping to address the affordable housing needs. Overcoming the disparities resulting from the past actions is not easy. Selfishly, I want a community where my kids can still run into their teachers at the local restaurant, where our employees can afford to live and be part of the community where they work, where the community is diverse and the people who make up our boards and commissions can represent the diversity of our nation. Our challenge is moving the discussion to further action, and we appreciate you being here to listen to this today and your efforts as we tackle these issues. Next, we're going to show a brief video which further explores the history of zoning in the United States and some of the implications. And then Kathy Sandoval will give further background on the history of disparity in the county and the West. So thank you.
Thank you, Dale.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans, or the backing for loans, to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans, you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth. And on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
Oh, thank you, County Commissioners. Good morning. This is Kathy Sandoval, Planner for Community Planning and Permitting. We shared this video with you as a jumping off point for our discussion today. In Boulder County, race matters. Race is centered in our equity and justice strategic priority because race is the biggest predictor of disproportionate outcomes and disparities in the United States. As the video highlighted, additionally, as government organization, it is our moral responsibility to interrupt institutional racism, which manifests through racist laws, policies, and practices, to advance racial equity conversations about race and the application of the racial equity tool. The county strives to normalize this conversation. As part of this strategic priority on equity and race, goal 1 is to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion at Boulder County by implementing the Boulder County Cultural Responsive and Inclusionary Roadmap. As we go through our slides, I invite you to reflect on the information we're sharing with you, take notes, and as we go through our slides, we will ask questions to consider, and we'll pause to hear your reflections. As you come into this conversation about racial equity in planning and zoning, you may be coming from a perspective of feeling or believing, thinking, or actions, and may have many of these reflections all at once. The racial equity work at Boulder County has involved several racial equity trainings and a useful tool that is used from the Pacific Education Group on Courageous Conversation About Race. I ask you to consider these 4 agreements. Stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, and accept non-closure. So in the spirit of this video, what we just saw, let's look further into the house that we live in. So the land that we are on, the developed patterns of the West, I identify as a brown Chicano, she, her, hers, Aya. I, along with my colleagues, acknowledge that Boulder County is on land within the territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people. We acknowledge the institution we represent was founded upon the exclusion and attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples and cultures. We acknowledge that the American Indian community in Boulder County today, elders of the past, present, and future generations. Next slide, please. So as we look at this history, we need to also acknowledge the land we are on and acknowledge that the United States was not a land that was vacant. As this map illustrates, the patterns of tribal territories prior to colonial development was comprehensive and covered the entire nation. This was not vacant land, and it is important to uncover this untold story. Next slide. So in uncovering this untold story, we also must acknowledge the framework on which this nation was founded. Under the doctrine of discovery, this concept where lands could be claimed to colonial powers, since colonial powers did not recognize the inhabitants that lived on this land and were not subjects of the European Christian monarch. So in other words, this doctrine is used to support decisions in validating or ignoring the lands of indigenous people in America and favor the conquest of colonial development. The Supreme Court decision of Chief Justice John Marshall explained in 1823 and applied the way colonial powers laid claim to indigenous lands. This doctrine institutionalized its acquisition of lands and now make up Boulder County. As this poster illustrates, Indian land was offered for sale and available in Colorado. Next slide. As the doctrine of discovery moved westward, and as earlier maps of the United States show, the map on the left illustrates in 1834 that Boulder County was considered Indian country, but by 1849, the area was proclaimed as unorganized territory, and the carving out of the states of Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arkansas, Texas, and Florida. Next slide. When we look more locally, how this was institutionalized by the creation of federal law and Indian law, the Federal and Indian Law Compact created a body of US laws that creates treaties, statutes, executive orders, court cases that define that only the federal government has a relationship with tribes, and the role of the tribes and states is under federal jurisdiction. As this relates to Boulder County, the Treaty of Fort Wise and Fort Laramie created a reservation for Arapaho and Cheyenne on the upper Arkansas and revised their claim to include the Arkansas River and Sand Creek, which became the precursor of the Sand Creek Massacre. Boulder County area is still considered unceded land by the Arapaho and Cheyenne. The winter cap for Chief Niwot is now E.B. Fines Park. And when you look at Boulder County Courthouse, a local reflection of a statue of a member of a 3rd Cavalry, Colorado Cavalry Regiment, whose soldiers previously fought in the Civil War, but in Colorado were moved more to involve indigenous people's displacement, and were also involved in the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. Next slide, please. So further institutionalization of these lands were created through the acts, the Homestead Act, the Surplus Land Act, that often were directed towards specific tribes to take over Indian lands, and in reality becomes the foundation of our settler communities. Next slide. So as part of this history, we see the federal law create the U.S. rectangular survey system, which describes lands by metes and bounds, which was a tradition created in Europe and came to the United States. This simple standard system sped up settlement and reduced disputes and bloodshed from boundary descriptions. Next slide. And along with these acts, such as the homestead, ceded and unceded negotiation of Indian lands, the rectangular survey system institutionalized land demarcation and contributed to the erasure of indigenous people throughout the United States and the who owns what in land procurement. Boulder County was created using the U.S. rectangular system as broken down into section, townships, and ranges. An art display at Baseline Road on the ramp to Highway 36 denotes the parallel of latitude 40 degrees, which defines the baseline between Kansas and Nebraska. Next slide. And then with the discovery of gold in Boulder County and other valuable minerals, the county is changed forever as the federal government issued government lots, patents, homestead lots, and the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne people are pushed on unceded land and private properties are established in Boulder County. Next slide. So I wanted to circle back about this untold story to have you realize that this is the foundation that we have in current Boulder County. And as part of this history, we also want to reflect the progression of development. So we can see with this slide, the different transformation in the 1800s of Indian lands and Spanish speakers from New Mexico colonizing from the South, which may have killed, disease, the starvation of many indigenous people. In the mid 1800s, we have the Treaty of Guadalupe, which was a peace treaty between 7 Ute groups and non-natives. Then in 1851, we have Larimer Treaty with the Cheyenne, which granted large portions of the Great Plains and removed Native Americans. And then up to the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where the Arapaho and Cheyenne people were killed, mutilated, raped, and shot. And then the development in the later 1800s of 2 reservations southwest end of the state, which were obliged to give up claim to other lands. And then by the later part of the 1879s, we have the Ute War and the disposition of the White River and Uncle Padre Ute relocations to Utes Desert region. Next slide, please. So as part of this history, we had talked briefly about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. We have Mexicans as American citizens, white and census, treated differently though. The migration is mainly from the South, where many grandparents and parents later moved from the area from central Mexico up northward from Mexico City. Initially single men, but married couples, and then whole family came from that area as well too. Next slide. This further shows the migration patterns before the Colorado was recognized as a state from early Spanish speakers arriving into Boulder County as parents and grandparents of people who later moved into this area were from central Mexico, lying northwest of Mexico City up through the Rio Grande Valley, and were from groups from the Tecas and smaller groups from the Oaxacans and adjoining Hidalgo and Durango area of Mexico. Next slide, please. Another local, more Latino history in Boulder County. In the town of Boulder, we see a variety of contrasting features, as well as being the home of county government. It was a commercial center which provided supplies for people living and working in the mountains and nearby communities on the plains. So we have the development of the city of Boulder and a strong population of Latinos living in the University Hills, or what is now known as sort of that University Hill downtown area. We also have the Longmont development, where a large Latino population was helped develop the sugar plant as well as sugar beet production, and worked in the fields of the Longmont area. And then in Lafayette, we also see coal mining and people coming in to provide coal mining and lived in the area of Lafayette. Next slide. Another part of the history is that we have African Americans also in Boulder County. This timeline kind of gives you some of that reflection we just went through. But interesting, we certainly see a pretty strong African-American population develop in the 1880s. And so for the US Census, we do see a strong African-American population living in the Goss Grave area of the city of Boulder, which is known as a little triangle, along with the creation of Lincoln Hills as a summer resort. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So this gives you an idea of what that little triangle looks like. Basically, it is from Canyon Boulevard on the north, 19th Street on the west, Goss Street on the south, and 23rd Street on the east. This was sort of what we call Boulder's other side of the tracks. It was here where a lot of African Americans lived, as well as Mexicans that often were living in substandard housing, considered an undesirable part of the city. It has unique characteristics in that there's these backlot houses on Goss Street. Although the buildings are very small, they were at least in the 1930s used as residents. They could have been in response to the overcrowding, since housing was generally unavailable to other parts of the city. So we have certainly students that are going to school there, and we have a prominent resident, Ruth Flowers, who went to school, became an attorney, an educator, and the first Black teacher in Boulder Valley School District. Next slide, please. As I stated earlier, we also have the development of Lincoln Hills. So as the middle class started to get more part of the African-American dream, they had more access to resources and funding, and created Lincoln Hills, which is adjacent to Boulder County, technically in Gilpin County, but it was accessible by car and train, and it was a thriving vacation destination for over 4 decades. At a main hotel and a tavern called Wink's Lodge, and it closed in 1965. But it became an opportunity for Black vacationers to come into the mountains. Next slide, please. But also an interesting sort of reflection as it relates maybe to Lincoln Hills is the development of Wonderview, which is a small development adjacent to sort of Lincoln Hills off of Coal Creek Canyon and the old Carter Lake and Indian Peak roads. The most interesting thing about this development is that the original developer, Otto Frederick, created covenants and regulations that he would apply as people purchased properties. Buyers were legally bound to be excluding non-whites from the use of Wonderview properties. And if they violated the covenants, they could carry a severe penalty. Often a property owner would be forfeited if they owned a Wonderview real estate back to Otto if that occurrence happened. So as an interesting reflection, we do see different segregation happen within Boulder County. Next slide, please. So with that, we did want to leave you some questions to consider after all the slides that we went through. When we examine the history of land use development, the comprehensive plan doesn't acknowledge a lot of this history. So we're asking you, perhaps, how can we establish a closer alignment with our strategic priority and equity and justice as it relates to our comprehensive plan, as well as how can we increase the emphasis on racial equity in land use planning and practices? If you have any reflections about that, we're open to having a dialogue about that. Or if you want to consider it and reflect on it later, we can certainly move on.
Kathy, for the presentation, for joining in this morning, I'm wondering, and I feel like we kind of need your all's guidance, if you'd like us to come back to some of these questions together as a group, maybe without the slides, to have some more conversation, or if you all prefer that we talk on them right now.
We can do either one. We do realize this is a longer presentation, so we do feel like sometimes it's necessary to sort of pause a little bit and kind of reflect on some of the things mid through, and then we'll have a wrap up sort of session as well.
I think, I mean, I'll just jump in and just, I won't necessarily respond to both questions, but one, this is such an important conversation. So I think there's a lot to talk about in the realm of, how do we share this history with public? I know there's other organizations that are doing similar work. So how can we kind of come together? The question about, the comprehensive plan, that seems to me like the policy where we can really affect. And so I'll be interested in some of the recommendations that you all as staff, because you have experience and have more history with, what policy decisions might be easy ones for us to really look at. And when I say easy, I mean easier than some of the other ones that might take more time or more work, et cetera. But I'm certainly supportive of both of these pieces of how do we do more? How do we not just acknowledge, but what are the opportunities to really change some of these pieces that have been historically excluded and accepted? Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think what I would like to say at this point, and I understand that there's a lot more to come, but just to take this in bite-sized chunks because there's a lot here. Number one, we do have to know our history, and it's so important to understand that. Just to acknowledge that this was not vacant land. There were people here. They were dispossessed brutally. And the community that we know right now, Boulder, the city of Boulder, which is where I have lived for the last 35 years, has its own history that we really need to know and understand. And I think that the what's been in my mind as we've been going through this, and your questions really bring front and center, and Dale, with his introduction on, just community planning, land use planning, and the things that are so embedded in the way that we look at development. There's this notion of compatibility, which is just sort of paramount, that we always look at, well, what's compatible with existing development? We don't want to disrupt expectations. And I have felt for a very long time that very idea, that paradigm of achieving compatibility is it's problematic in and of itself, because it just perpetuates the status quo. And it also is founded on the idea that that property values have to be preserved above all, that's our primary goal here, is to not diminish the property values of the people who are already there, but also that anything smaller, anything more dense, a duplex, a triplex, a multifamily, that's somehow bad if it were to be located next to a single family residence. And these things that we just embed in our codes perpetuate the status quo. So it's just something, that I've been thinking about, as we think about community development patterns.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Levy.
So,
with that,
Kathy, if I could jump in. Thank you. This is really interesting. Thank you for giving us examples locally where these issues we hear about across the country, redlining, that kind of thing, are in place. It seems to me getting rid of that kind of thing is easy. Now we're into some things that are much more subtle, and Claire referred to one of compatibility. And it's going to be a little bit more opaque. And you brought up Lafayette. I live in Louisville, and I've read some about the early days in the coal towns, Superior, Erie, Lafayette, Louisville, and a lot of ethnicities, and kind of how they work things through. But I even door knocking, I would in Lafayette, I ran into a Hispanic man that was very much into Lafayette and still had the rivalry with Louisville High and all that kind of thing. But he talked about how there were issues in his lifetime growing up in Lafayette, and the difficulties that still exist. And so it's still there. We need to be systematic about it. And I don't know the answers, but I'm interested in exploring. I think Claire brings up a good point of compatibility, and we know in Boulder County, if something is next door to somebody, they may not like it if it doesn't look like what they have, and that makes it a challenge. So I don't have all the answers. I'm really appreciative of you and your department taking this dive, and the county into this conversation, and we have a lot more to do, and I want to be part of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Jones. With that, I'll turn this over to Alberto de los Rios to start our next section.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. Alberto de los Rios here with Community Planning and Permitting, Long Range Planner. The next section that I will be touching about is examples of racial bias, which includes redlining and exclusionary zoning. So after the Civil War, there was a time of prosperity that actually started integrating Blacks with whites post-slavery. However, this didn't last long. So in the early 1900s, across many municipalities in the United States, segregation ordinances started surfacing. For instance, in the case that you see here on the screen, in the city of Baltimore, no white person may move into a block in Baltimore where the majority of residents of that block are Negroes, nor may a Negro move into a block where the majority of the residents are white. This was adopted in many ways and with different iterations across other cities, in which through homeownership and through the physical allocation of racial covenants, Blacks were not able to have the same benefits of homeownership and be in the same spaces that their white counterparts would. Next slide, please. So in 1917, the court case Buchanan versus Warley surfaced, in which the decision was not based on how the 14th Amendment and the equal protection for people under the laws, which was intended to provide those for everybody, focus on freedom of contract. And so the person who intended to sell a home where it was predominantly white to an African-American person was being obstructed of the sale, and thus Buchanan sued the city of Louisville in Kentucky. As a consequence, the Supreme Court ruled this to be unconstitutional because it was depriving the Black homeowner and the white homeowner from a fair due process clause of the 14th Amendment. However, this continued across the entire country as a common practice, and it unfolded into many other ways, which I'll be discussing next. Next slide, please. So some of the origins of exclusionary zoning come from the Hoover administration, in which the administration created a model zoning law. As part of this, some of the justifications was that planning is necessary to maintain the nation of the race, meaning that through the physical ordinance of zoning, it would regulate and restrict people from interacting physically through homeownership and living spaces. And they consider that maintaining whites away from Blacks was a way to keep a just and fair and orderly society. This also justified the terms of segregation, exclusion, limitation, and determination of public and private spaces. Next slide, please. As a local example, we have the city of Denver with what we discussed in the video, The House We Live In, known as redlining. So in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure bank loans to Black individuals or individuals who were not minority, but still lived in those areas who were considered red. As you can see in the map to your right, those areas were primarily industrial or are currently those areas that still are in majority African-American. And as a result, the rates of homeownership and wealth acquisition was not possible for these communities. And as a consequence, this were considered to be blighted, and oftentimes they were refused public services such as water, police service, fire rescue, and other things that are entitled by right. Next slide, please. Another local example that we have is the abundance of single-family zoning across Boulder County. If you see, there are only very little spots that are circled in red that would allow for multifamily zoning. The Hoover administration also took a big part of this by promoting single-family home ownership. In a case called Euclid versus Amber, the majority opinion stated that the apartment house is a mere parasite. It detracts from the safety of streets and the residential character of the neighborhood, which would then lead to it being destroyed and devaluing the properties. This was a racial animus, but it was still passed through the Supreme Court because it justified governments to exclude certain types of development for the sake of maintaining order and sanitation and the preservation of property value. Next slide, please. Something that was also very common in Denver County and also Boulder County was restrictive covenants and intimidation. For one instance, in the early 1900s, Denver was severely distributed by KKK power. And this also trickled down to Boulder County by having heavy animosity for the Latinx community. Here I share a little excerpt from Marta Valenzuela, who shared her experience of moving to Boulder County in the 1970s. Even then, there were still areas that did not allow Mexicans in the area. So this animosity was justified in private business practices to exclude people from participating. Next slide, please. It's important to also realize how public hearings are carried out in the county and beyond. So often those who are most outspoken are those who consider themselves to be neighborhood defenders, or NIMBYs. NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard. And while neighbors with all viewpoints are welcome to participate, the times in which these public hearings take place and the limitations due to employment, transportation, and other constraints often do not lead for everyone to be at the table. And thus, those with a little bit more privilege and perhaps more community and political organization are those who are able to share their word. And oftentimes we have a very skewed perception of what the opinion is about a certain matter. Next slide, please. A local example that I want to share is the Twin Lakes area, where there are two parcels that, according to the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, it is designated as Area 2 and thus intended for annexation into the city since the 1970s. These parcels were deemed fitting for annexation because the urban services are readily available and diversity of housing types is a growing concern, meaning that there needs to be a higher housing stock and more affordable housing needs to be built. The parcels are designated as low density and public land use respectively, but the Boulder County Housing Authority and the Boulder Valley School District requested that the median density residential zoning would be allowed in these parcels in order to build affordable housing. As a result, staff from both the city and the county made a recommendation to change the designation. However, this had been met with widespread opposition on the basis that the development of affordable housing is not compatible. It disrupts the current character of the neighborhood and threatens the property costs for existing homeowners, among other reasons. Next slide, please. These are some of the comments that we saw across public hearings, and we can start seeing some of the themes here, including the character of a neighborhood, compatibility, the disruption of peace of mind and quality of life, the fear of proposed density, and how that affects the current homeowners. But I feel like it misses the picture of those who are not yet in place. How are those individuals going to be benefited? Whose ideals are we upholding? Who gets to use the open space? And if we shift the conversation on race with an understanding that historically planning and zoning decisions often under face do not appear racially motivated, they still have a disparate impact and are in some cases implicitly racially motivated. Next slide, please. Again, as with Kathy, I want to open this for discussion, but we can always come back to these questions. But these are some of the things to consider about inclusionary and exclusionary zoning. So for inclusionary zoning, planning ordinances that require a given share of new construction to be affordable by people with low to moderate incomes Oftentimes, Boulder County has no inclusionary zoning practices. How can the county start implementing those, and how can they be enforced? Also, how can we make a preservation of open land, space, and rural character compatible with increasing racial equity in zoning practices, and also the demand for increased affordability and access to housing? When we talk about protecting neighborhood character, whose neighborhoods are we protecting? And when we think about the number of denials for or the difficulty in building multifamily housing, have these decisions been viewed through a racial equity lens? How many decisions like this create a pattern leading to a disparate impact on racial minorities or those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged?
Good morning, Alberto. Thank you. I appreciate this section of this presentation, and I'll just make some comments. As a lot of you know, my background is in housing. I've spent my full previous career addressing the financial wealth gap in this country alongside a National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, doing work around Boulder County in the state of Colorado, working to address these issues that have systematically kept specifically our monolingual Spanish-speaking communities outside of the ability to create financial equity. And so this is a really, it's an important conversation. So I appreciate y'all bringing that up. I've also been part of the Boulder County, the Latino task force is separate, but the Latino History Project, I worked with them when I was teaching it in St. Vrain, kind of supporting that curriculum and also just reviewing the work, et cetera. So I've had some other insight into that work and the history, working with our youth to try and teach our youth. And it is a reminder this morning that it's not just our youth who need to know our history. So I appreciate y'all bringing that up. I mean, there's so many different pieces in here, but I love this conversation and hope that we'll continue it in regards to ordinances, regards to zoning, regards to looking at the area, the different areas and the opportunities. One of the ordinances that I've brought up to talk about, not just specifically to building, but how can we look at priority purchasing for homeowners that want to live in Boulder County outside of investors? And how does that fit into this conversation when we talk about different policies and opportunities for inclusionary, not necessarily zoning? The other piece is around co-op housing, which I think is kind of where we're looking at. What does that look like, and how do we open up that opportunity for folks to understand what that might look like? So I think there's definitely some work that we could do together, and I'm just really pleased to hear that y'all are interested in working that way. And it sounds like you have been for a while too. As you already shared at the beginning, I think Dale said this was a presentation done in September of 2020. And so I'm really interested later at another time to hear kind of the feedback you got from Planning Commission and any other public folks that might have been participating in that conversation as well. I think the question is going to be around how do we get community to engage and support, because I was in that public hearing, participated in that public hearing that you mentioned around Twin Lakes, and heard a lot of those similar conversations. And there was only a handful of us on that call that were asking to really consider affordable housing and in Boulder County. So I do believe that there's more people out there that share that. And so the question that y'all brought up around public meetings, I've been having that conversation too with our BOCC to look at how and analyze with our staff to find out how can we really change that dynamic and bring more people in. So again, I'm pleased to hear some of these different pieces and know that we're gonna be able to work together to address these issues. But I want to give my fellow commissioners the opportunity to reflect on these questions as well.
Yeah, thanks. And it always takes me a sec to get my cursor on the right screen so I can unmute myself, but to respond to these questions and to what you presented. I think this is really a tough one, actually, in some ways, because Boulder County's comprehensive plan And the way we've looked at the county and had this agreement with the city of Boulder over areas 1, 2, and 3, and what's appropriate for annexation and development and what should be preserved. The policies I generally support, actually, and that policy that has shaped a lot of the development of Boulder County is that urban levels of development belong in municipalities. And that's where the services are. That's where the schools are located. That's where you have opportunities to have the kind of density that would support public transportation. That's where you've got the tax base, the ability to impose a sales tax, to fund public safety, all of those things. Walkable neighborhoods, the things that we want in community form, that happens in municipalities. And I think that's the right thing to do. That means, however, that a lot of land in Boulder County is unavailable for development that could provide a lot of housing for people who need housing. So there really is a tension there. But I guess I contrast development patterns, land use patterns in Boulder County with a place like Arapahoe County or Douglas County or Jefferson County, where you've got all of these subdivisions, just the epitome of urban sprawl all over the place, gobble up a lot of land. They're low density and they're environmentally unsustainable, economically unsustainable for the county because of the way Gallagher has enshrined low property taxes, now repealed, but that's really there in terms of the financing of public services. And that if that development had been in a municipality, things, the shape of those communities would be totally different. And those are not affordable communities. So sprawl in and of itself does not create affordability. It has to be really intentional. So I support our overall goals of not having urban level development in unincorporated Boulder County. But having said that, we do have this area too. And Twin Lakes is an area that was appropriate for development. And that was a passionate knockdown, drag out fight in which the people who could benefit from that housing, the people who might have been able to live there, they're not here. They have no way to show up because they've been priced out of Boulder County. And so it's a completely lopsided conversation, and we need more people to show up. We need to empower the people who could benefit from that to actually show up and have a voice. And if they're not here and they can't speak, then as elected officials, it's our job to speak on their behalf. We've got a situation. There is a tension there between preserving open land, separating cities, not having them grow together. The super IGA that said cities, you have these urban boundaries, you grow within those boundaries, and then it's up to them to have the appropriate land use laws that will facilitate affordable housing. But I'm 100% on board with Boulder County Housing Authority being very active within municipalities, supporting our municipalities in adopting inclusionary housing ordinances, in creating more density, in allowing more density to develop, and I was about to say in appropriate areas, and that's the language we use without even thinking about it. So what do I mean when I say appropriate areas? I don't know. I need to stop saying that, actually, because it's not as if there is an appropriate and an inappropriate area for higher density. So, there are things that are just so baked into the language that we use that we don't even think about it. And so there, we have to retrain our minds on a lot of this stuff. Even the notion of what would reduce property values, and those statements that you called out Alberto from the Twin Lakes hearings. Those are just classic, just classic. I've been doing land use work for, well, since about 1989. And that's all is code for, we don't want those people here living next to us. And it doesn't sound that way. Nobody actually says that. So there are some terms that you use instead, so that you talk about the things that are socially and politically acceptable, but we know in a lot of cases what's behind that.
So I want to be respectful. I think there's 2 more sections of this to be presented, but to Claire's point, I don't know in the Twin Lakes situation if, I don't think people would say that it was implicit racism. I think they would say it's quality of life and all those kinds of things. And I think that gets at the tough part of this thing, is that people aren't likely intentional that way, but that has its net effect, and people need to start realizing it, I think. And that's a big ask, because people, this is hard work. It's uncomfortable, like Kathy said at the start of the presentation. And I don't know, we need to foster that conversation somehow, though. Maybe this presentation will do that. But it's so subtle, and it, like Claire said, it's baked into how we say words. And Twin Lakes was a good example of something that could have allowed housing that's more affordable. That just didn't happen because people around there didn't want it. So that's I'm anxious to hear more about transportation, for instance, on this.
Great, thank you. I appreciate everyone's comments, and for the sake of time, because we still have a lot to discuss, I want to introduce the next speaker, Diane Hardin, to talk about her section.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Alberto. I'm Diane Hardin. I identify as white, non-Hispanic, she, her, hers are my pronouns, and I work for CCP code compliance. I'm going to speak about manufactured home communities, centering the discussion around racial equity, segregation, and exclusionary zoning here in Boulder County. I'll speak briefly about the broad history of mobile home parks, take a closer look at some zoning and policy history in Boulder, and hope to spur reflection about how we can work to provide greater protections and equity in these communities. Mobile home community history is really fun, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today, to try to leave a little more space for other topics or comments and questions at the end. Briefly, with increased mobility in the early 1900s, travelers were able to venture further away from hotels near train stations. And the wealthier began to acquire these really luxurious custom-built trailers. Some of the first trailer parks were developed to accommodate and attract these very wealthy customers. Next slide, please. During the Great Depression, when people were losing homes, farms, and jobs, Depression-era trailer settlements housing itinerant workers started to appear. And when they became permanent settlements, exclusionary zoning ordinance began to appear as well, disallowing permanent habitation or restricting trailers to less desirable locations. In the 1940s, the government needed wartime housing, so bought up the entire industry capacity of mobile homes and moved them into military bases for housing. After the war, many of these mobile homes were then moved into college towns for housing under the GI Bill. And some of the early civilian mobile home communities grew up in college towns like Boulder. It is important here again to acknowledge that African Americans and other people of color were systematically excluded from many of the housing and education benefits under the GI Bill. And this had long-term consequences, still very present in society today. Next slide, please. For a brief time in the 1950s, mobile home community residents actually had higher incomes and educational levels than the US population at large. But when these students under the GI Bill graduated from college and got jobs and started reaping the benefits that the government had invested in them, there was a movement of this mostly white population out of mobile home parks and into single family residential suburbs. I tend to switch back and forth between the terms mobile homes and manufactured homes. So a brief note about terminology. Mobile homes are now defined as factory built homes from the period when they started being built greater than 8 feet in width up to 1976. Post 1976, they're called manufactured homes. That's when Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, started requiring all mobile homes to be built under HUD inspection and carry a HUD seal off the assembly line. This standard relates to some modern day inequities we will look at in more detail in a little bit. Next slide, please. Looking more specifically at Boulder County, I would argue that the 1944 code disallowing trailers anywhere except in licensed trailer parks or for housing of domestic servants on a lot where the trailer was parked is an example of exclusionary zoning. In 1965, mobile home parks were allowed in the multifamily district. In 1968, they were restricted to the multiple family suburban district. Approaching today, mobile home park zoning was established in Boulder County by DC 91-0006, approved by a 1992 resolution. Without this change to our code in the early 90s, would we still have mobile home parks in unincorporated Boulder County today? This far-seeing and at the time cutting-edge zoning change helps prevent or at least slow down the market forces that can easily lead to redevelopment of mobile home parks into other uses that can lead to permanent displacement of mobile home residents. Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan Policy 7.08 addresses the preservation and development of manufactured housing, and Boulder County Comprehensive Plan Public Health and housing and economic elements have been updated to support mobile home park protections. Next map, please. Or next slide, excuse me. So this map shows in orange where mobile home parks were allowed in the multifamily district in 1965. And next slide for comparison. This map is zoomed in, but roughly shows the same area, showing in purple the manufactured home park district today, where mobile home parks are allowed in unincorporated Boulder County today. So establishment of that district recognized the mobile home communities that were existing at the time it was created, and it was an important protection. Granted, some of the multifamily district areas from the 1965 map have since become incorporated into cities. So it's not an accurate measure of true net gain or loss of mobile home communities, but it does serve as a good example to show how small the areas are today where this type of community can exist in unincorporated Boulder County. Next slide, please. This 2013 map comes from the University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service and uses 2010 census data, with each dot representing one individual color-coded by race. I borrowed this concept of overlaying the mobile home parks onto this racial dot map from Crystal Launder from the city of Boulder. So we can think in terms of race and why it is so important to do so when we're talking about mobile home communities. The first time I saw this map, looking at it through my privileged white perspective, my first thought was, wow, look at these beautiful little islands of racial diversity in Boulder County. Other people who saw this map, immediately saw ugly images of segregation. So there are some mobile home parks that have high Latinx populations. Table Mesa Village and San Souci in South Boulder, those are in unincorporated Boulder County. They may be more racially integrated, but they do have more vulnerable populations of older and less affluent residents compared to other areas of the county. Next slide, please. So why does race matter in mobile home parks? If you think in terms of how people accumulate wealth over generations, Traditional homeowners own both the land and the home located on the land and can generally expect the value of their home and land to appreciate over time. Mobile homeowners generally rent the land where their mobile home is housed. They only own the mobile home itself, which is considered personal property or chattel, and it depreciates over time. Compounded to that is the fact that Latinx, African American, and Asian families acquire a greater proportion of their wealth from their homeowner equity, and so are disproportionately impacted by these intersections of race and zoning. Next slide, please. The next several slides are from a portion of the Planning Commission presentation, which was led by Rachel Arndt from Public Health. I'm going to paraphrase and summarize parts of her presentation here. We'll be looking at the current state of mobile home communities in Boulder County and what vulnerabilities or protections they have. Mobile home communities are made up of homes that families live in, just like any other community, neighborhoods that kids play in and grow up in, housing for elderly couples and people with disabilities. Thinking back to the race dot map, mobile home communities can be seen both as little islands of racial diversity and examples of segregated communities that, if lost, could result in a significant loss of racial diversity in our county. Boulder County is home to over 3,700 manufactured home households living in 38 manufactured home parks. They provide a scarce resource to the county, affordable housing, which is housing that costs no more than 30% of a household's gross income, including utilities. While there are some small mom and pop mobile home parks, many small independent parks are being purchased by national conglomerates or hedge funds. Next slide, please. So this bifurcated ownership model, exclusionary zoning, historic siting, and lack of maintenance by park owners creates challenges and vulnerabilities for residents, such as rising land prices causing unpredictable and often unaffordable increases in monthly lot rentals for residents on fixed or low incomes. Lack of mobile home park zoning in other counties can cause that rapid redevelopment and displacement of residents. Mobile home park owners' maintenance deferral results in extended water and sewage disruptions. This deferred maintenance can result in old water and sewer infrastructure susceptible to breaking. There can be poor road maintenance. Overcharging of water and other utilities leads to residents being priced out of their own homes. Poor water sources could lead to unpalatable drinking water or inadequate water supplies. San Lazaro Mobile Home Park is a good example of that. Lack of secondary water standard enforcement results in the type of unpalatable water San Lazaro experiences. Aging home infrastructure can also result in poor water quality. And mobile home communities are especially vulnerable to natural disasters and severe weather events. This is Sans Souci pictured on the right. This is a good park to look at for issues such as location in floodplains, lack of physical access to parks and open spaces, lack of physical links to public transportation or other services, lack of sidewalks and aging home infrastructure. These problems not only threaten the existing affordable housing stock, they also result in serious health inequities and environmental injustices for mobile home park residents. Next slide, please. So a cautionary tale from Lyons, which lost 77% of its manufactured housing in the 2013 floods. Riverbend Mobile Home Park was completely lost and never replaced. A whole community just lost by one event. The Lyons Emergency Assistance Fund commissioned a report after the floods and looked at the challenges to replacing affordable housing, such as the high cost of land, low availability of developable lots, a high cost of infrastructure, and they predicted correctly that it would be difficult to replace lost mobile home parks in Lyons. Next slide, please. When residents do advocate for more favorable conditions or improvements in their parks, they are especially vulnerable to retaliation from park owners, such as threats of eviction. Speaking as a code compliance specialist, I've seen with my own eyes land use and building code enforcement misused by park owners to selectively penalize some residents. Next slide, please. On the county level, we looked briefly already at the establishment of the manufactured home park district, which is an important protection, helping to prevent rapid redevelopment of mobile home parks into pricey housing developments or non-residential uses, which can cause displacement of existing residents. Public health really for the county has served as the leader to work toward reducing inequities and increasing protections in mobile home communities by bringing together residents and partners to lobby for change. There have been updates to the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan, public health element, and housing and economic elements, providing clear policy direction that manufactured housing parks be preserved in Boulder County and that the county establish protections for residents. Next slide. And the city of Boulder has been especially active over the years to increase protections and address inequities. There's a guide available from the city in both Spanish and English describing the mobile home park owners' rights and protections. The Colorado Coalition of Mobile Home Owners is another good site to go to for resources and better understanding of rights. And there are strategies that can be adopted to decrease rates of mobile home depreciation or reduce abuses and inequities, such as the resident-owned communities idea. Next slide, please. Until recently, it was really the municipality level pushing change. And again, in Boulder County Public Health, in particular, Rachel Arndt has really been playing the leadership role in the mobile home community engagement and protections, bringing together those essential partners and residents. Cities with home rule in the past could pass their own ordinances protecting mobile home communities. Broomfield and the city of Boulder passed ordinances to try to address some of the abuses and inequities. Many of these protections are now codified in state bills, except for the sale of pre-1976 homes. So the state of Colorado Division of Housing, Building Codes and Standards regulates the construction and sale of mobile homes. These standards adopted at the county levels, while meant to address safety concerns, can have unintended consequences that increase inequities. Mobile homes built before the 1976 HUD standards, even if they have modifications, generally aren't accepted as compliant with the HUD code. And the FHA doesn't insure mortgages on manufactured homes built before 1976. And most other mortgage insurance follows FHA policy. So it can be very difficult or impossible to sell these older homes. Next slide, please. So recent positive government action on the state level includes House Bill 201196, which addressed resident priorities of retaliation, arbitrary eviction, utility billing transparency, landlord responsibilities, and right to privacy. House Bill 201201 helped to address the challenge of the bifurcated ownership model and set standards for potential community purchases of parks, those resident-owned communities. House Bill 191309 created a Mobile Home Park Act dispute resolution and enforcement program so that residents could address their concerns without having to go through unaffordable legal processes. And very important, it gives local control to the counties, authorizing them to enact ordinances protective of mobile home park residents' rights. This is a key area we could potentially capitalize on to do more to create equity in these communities. The county can leverage this authority in a very intentional way at the local level. As we continue our racial equity work, I hope that the commissioners will reflect about how decisions can impact communities in disproportionate ways and help us find solutions that decrease vulnerabilities and support and grow equity in our mobile home parks. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to pass this on now to Angel Bond for a discussion of transportation and affordable housing.
Thank you, Diane. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Angel Bond. I'm the Mobility for All Program Manager. I identify as a white woman, pronouns she, her, hers. Today I'm going to get into a little bit about transportation and racial equity. This image here is an American way of life. And I believe that this image is super powerful because it illustrates the racial injustice of centering our transportation system on the personal auto. And it also demonstrates the stark economic gap between people based on race. As you've heard earlier in this presentation, transportation and land use are extremely connected. You can't look at transportation without looking at the interconnected nature of land use and housing policies. People often, what we're seeing here in Boulder County is that they're driving until they qualify for cheaper rents or cheaper mortgages. And what that does is it puts owning a car as a necessity instead of an option. And we see that low-income neighborhoods are moving farther out, and they're not necessarily accounting for the full cost of owning a car. Earlier in the presentation, Dale had mentioned affordable living, and I just wanted to reiterate that affordable living is the combined cost of housing and transportation, and that should not exceed 45%. We are seeing more and more Boulder County residents exceed that amount, and the average moderate income in Boulder County is spending 54%, and moderate is defined as $56,000. So that's just really not attainable for many people to live and stay in Boulder County. This is just a brief timeline of transportation and civil rights. Many of our current transportation policies have their roots in racial inequality. And that's why it's not really surprising that a lot of the civil rights movements and efforts, protests, have been tied to transportation access issues. Beginning with the railroads, by 1872, the railroads had received over 150 million acres of Native American land. And they were often built with the forced and unpaid labor of African American slaves and Chinese immigrants on land that was displaced from Native Americans. In 1896, this is where we really get the term separate but equal. In Plessy versus Ferguson, it was really a case about separated train cars. In 1955, we have the arrest of Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat, which led to the Montgomery bus boycotts and the broader civil rights movement. In 1956, we have the Federal Highway Act. And the Federal Highway Act was an ambitious act to connect all of the states, but it also led to the demolition of many neighborhoods of color. In 1961, we have the Freedom Rides, which is the Congress on Racial Equity, took Greyhound buses from DC to New Orleans to directly challenge local segregation laws. In 1964, we have the signing of the Civil Rights Act, but it's not until 1994 when we have the Environmental Justice Executive Order that was signed by Bill Clinton that really ended up leading to some of the Title VI requirements for the Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration. When we look at the interstate highway system, what we see is a very ambitious network, but often communities of color were directly targeted for destruction, either by using eminent domain or paying less for the properties than what they were worth, and also by bisecting neighborhoods to where there was no real connectivity to your neighbor that you used to live by. This effort really led to the prioritization of efficient car commuting through neighborhoods of color, and oftentimes led to the white flight situation that we see with white homeowners moving out to the suburbs and commuting into downtown business districts. Here locally in Denver, we have our first hint of I-25 with the Valley Highway Plan. This is a schematic from 1944 where CDOT was evaluating the location of the future interstate. And they really evaluated Colorado, which was the most direct route, Colorado Avenue. But that was deemed not an option due to using redlining maps that characterized that zone as being relatively high character. Instead, there was a choice to align the future I-25 corridor along the Platte River Valley, which included low-value residential districts or redline districts and industrial districts. This decision has a lasting impact on environmental justice. It impacts the air quality. There's higher rates of asthma, noise pollution. There's limited connectivity to grocery stores, parks, communities, and community facilities. And you look at Elyria Swansea, and it is right at the intersection of I-25 and I-70, and it is the most polluted zip code in the US consistently. This slide really talks about our investment in transportation since 1956. And what you'll see is over the last 65 years, we have prioritized highways and car movement. 78% of our capital investment has been in highways, and that is juxtaposed with mass transit and rail, which makes up 10% of our capital investments. And really what we've been talking about with this is that's prioritizing movement of car vehicles through neighborhoods of color. On the right here, you see a street pattern example. This was included in a 1938 Federal Housing Administration technical bulletin that was talking about how to plan profitable neighborhoods. Here, they actually label the good street designs as the one that prioritizes automobile travel. You'll see in this community, there's only 3 ways in and out of the neighborhood. And the bad neighborhood, quote unquote, this actually has a maximum connectivity because people can walk all of these distances. They could take the shortest distance to get to the grocery store, ride a bike. You could easily run transit service through this neighborhood. So really there was a concerted effort, even starting in the 30s, to prioritize automobile travel. I'm going to go ahead and show you what the lasting impacts of these decisions has been on one of our concrete example here in Boulder County. So it's important to understand that transportation is a pillar of economic opportunity, as well as a linchpin service that allows people to access all other aspects of their life. So I'm going to show an example of Vista Village Mobile Home Park in East Boulder and how much opportunity they have access to based on the mode that they're using. So this is the 20-minute walk. So you can see that they can reach look here, Valmont, just by walking within 20 minutes. Then you take the bike, and actually the bike infrastructure here is pretty good because they can actually reach the Central Boulder district to get jobs or access opportunities here. If you look at the bus, you'll see a much more limited travel shed is what we call this. And this is making the assumption that people will walk a half mile or a quarter mile to access the bus. But then you look at what, how much opportunity people have access to if they have an automobile. They could get jobs in Southern Longmont, Broomfield, Louisville, Superior in a 20-minute drive. So this really, all of these decisions have really accumulated in pushing people towards one of the most expensive options of transportation. I'm going to give another example of the impacts of designing for cars. This example is going to be in Gun Barrel. We're going to look at Heatherwood Elementary, which is located here in the red. And we took a random house that was in the middle of this suburban land development. As the crow flies, the distance between these two locations is approximately a mile. And just for reference, Safe Routes to School says that that would be an acceptable distance for elementary school kids to walk to. But if somebody wanted to walk or bike to that school, it actually would take them 3.1 miles if they go the northern route, or 2.2 miles to go the southern route. This also has impacts on what transit's available, because we have the 205 bus in Gun Barrel that is probably going to be canceled due to lack of ridership, because there's just not the density and the demand in that area to justify it. Here we see some figures on percentage of workers without a vehicle by race. And you can see there's a stark disparity between who has access to an automobile, with 2.8% of white people having access to an automobile, and the most extreme case, African Americans, about 10%, 9.5, do not have access to an automobile. Excuse me, I misspoke when I said the first one. What this has resulted in is an auto loan crisis. So currently, I just want to note that auto loans in America are $1.2 trillion. That almost rivals college loans, which is $1.5 trillion. So really what we're seeing is people are taking out loans and having that cost burden of financing an automobile in order to have access to opportunity. So what specifically makes transit and other multimodal transportation systems work? Well, it has to do with what's connected to land use decisions, first and foremost, a lot of these, but frequency of the bus really has a huge impact on whether people are going to take the bus or not. If you miss your bus and it only comes every hour, then you're less likely to take it because you're going to be an hour late to work if you miss the bus. Also, density surrounding the transit lines also has a huge impact. What kind of activity centers are there around transit? What is within walking or biking distance of that quarter mile to a half mile of what's called a walk shed? So pedestrian and bicycle connections, it's important to understand that all transit riders are pedestrians at some point. So we need to make sure that we have sidewalks in place and bus or bike routes in place. Also, the reliability of the service. Can you count on the bus getting there and getting you where you need to go on time? And one of the key ways that people could save money on transportation is by destinations. If the transit system only goes to the downtown central business district, then that's not a viable option for you for going to the grocery store, taking your kids to school, going to the rec center. If you don't have Saturday or Sunday service, it's going to make you much more likely to own a car and have to depend on a car for all other aspects of your life. So it's important that transit is able to serve all aspects of your life. I'm going to go ahead and give an example of disparities in transit investment. So here, this is a local example in Denver, and what we're looking at, what I want to kick us off with when we look at this map is oftentimes riders of color and low-income riders are considered what's called dependent riders. And it's quite an unpleasant term, but basically it means that people the transit agencies, they don't necessarily have to attract them to use the bus or the rail. No matter how bad the service, no matter the lack of amenities, people will still come and use that service. Whereas white suburban commuters are often considered to be choice riders. And you have to attract them through incentives to ride the bus. You have to have expensive park and rides. You have to have really nice amenities to be able to attract them to use the bus. So this is a really clear example of where you have the choice rider versus the dependent rider mentality. We have here we have the Colfax corridor, which the surrounding area has about 125,000 people within a half a mile. And there's 22,000 riders per day, and only 52% of the riders are white. Whereas you look here at the Southeast rail line, and you only have approximately 10,000 people within a half mile walking distance to the stations. There's only 8,000 riders per day, and 73% of the riders are white. The cost that was put into attracting riders to the rail line was pretty significant. And whereas Colfax, if you travel along Colfax, you'll see that there's many bus stops that don't even have benches or bus stop shelters. And that stark contrast is really illuminated when you look at this case study. And not to mention the RTD subsidies per boarding. So for each boarding, RTD subsidizes travel. For buses, it's approximately $5 per boarding. With light rail, it's about $7.59, and with commuter rail, it is $16.63. So you can see that there is definitely a higher subsidy for the light rail and commuter rail riders. So I want to talk a little bit about sustainability. So sustainability and the climate crisis have had huge implications on our life. Transportation is the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases currently. Our climate crisis cannot be addressed without also addressing equity. People of color and low-income populations are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change and are often hit first and worst when there's climate crises. EVs are often looked at as a way to address the climate crisis, and while they are super important at reducing greenhouse gases, unfortunately, they're not affordable or accessible for populations most in need. Many of our policy tools that we use to promote to promote EV access, they rely on rebates or tax credits, and those just aren't effective tools at reaching low-income households who can't even afford to purchase a slightly newer conventional fuel vehicle. We can make policies to make electrification more equitable by investing in transit buses, electrification, paratransit, also by investing in EV car sharing or ride hailing options, and ensure that these new technologies are accessible for people of color and low-income households. When we look at our space efficiency and how we're going to tackle the climate crisis, we really do need to look at the co-benefits of reducing greenhouse gases and supporting equity, because transportation is access to opportunity. We will have a larger impact on reducing greenhouse gases if we look at land use and transportation, specifically multimodal transportation, in conjunction with each other. Also investing in things like buses and biking and walking, that allows us to use the most that we can out of our existing infrastructure and focus on locating affordable housing near transit. Here, this is an example of the amount of space that's needed for 2 parking spots, the amount of space to pull in and pull out of these parking spots, and the opportunity cost that we are making when we look at parking is a 2-bedroom apartment, a small 2-bedroom apartment, but nevertheless, it's still somebody who could be living closer to the economic opportunity. I'm going to go over a couple of examples here locally. So Ride Free Lafayette is a local example of racial equity in action. In our 2015 needs assessment, we looked at a transit propensity index. And here in Lafayette, it's not really outlined, you can see a higher need. So the red and orange areas are a higher need area. And what higher need means is that there's a larger Latinx population, there's higher levels of poverty, there's more older adults, there's more people with disabilities who would potentially depend on transit. And this was prior to Ride Free Lafayette. This was the map of the RTD Flex Ride service area. So you can see a large gap here. There was no Flex Ride service in Lafayette, and the wider, wealthier communities surrounding Lafayette did have access to this on-demand transit service. We were able to launch in 2020 a new service that is Ride Free Lafayette, and it is free, fare free, so anybody could hop on and use the service. It's been going extremely well. Even during a pandemic, we've been able to average about 3 passengers per hour, which is good for an on-demand service. So we're looking forward to hopefully bolstering this success story and providing access to opportunity in Lafayette a bit more. And additionally, we also work with Boulder County Housing Authority and in order to ensure that the residents of those communities are able to access transportation options. In particular at Kestrel, we worked really hard to expand the transportation access there by providing RTD eco passes, advocating for the extension of the 228 bus so that residents can have access to it, working with the city of Lafayette to ensure pedestrian connections to the grocery store right across the way, ensuring food security and access to the Sister Carmen food pantry. And we just most recently, we expanded a new car share pilot at Kestrel, providing residents an opportunity and discounts to access car sharing. So our question to think about is what would investment in transportation look like in Boulder County if we used a racial equity lens to guide our investment decisions? And I know we're running a little bit short on time, so we'll hold this question in our heads until after the public engagement so that Alberto has a chance to get through his. So I will turn this over to Alberto, who's going to talk to us today about community engagement.
Thank you, Angel. So as we wrap everything together, it is important to say, how are we going to get back to the community? So the basis of community participation is through community engagement. And as you see here on the right side, that's Arnstein's ladder of participation, which defines the ways in which governments and public officials can decide to engage the community. They can decide to not have them participate at all. They can tokenize them, or they can provide them with some degree of citizen power. Next slide, please. The IAP2 has a spectrum of public participation that is worthwhile looking at because it gives us an idea of some of the examples of how we experience different degrees of participation, both with the government and the public. So this way, it can also help government officials to understand what is the goal of this project? How are we trying to have the public participate? What is our promise? And what are some of the examples? So I would always recommend coming back to this one for reference. Next slide, please. Up next, I want to briefly share a history of how community engagement has been shaped by some historical events starting from the 1950s. It is important to understand that the paradigm of engagement has never been the same, and due to very important events that moved the entire nation, it really shaped up about the conversation of who gets to be present, who gets to share their word, and how is this affected. Next slide, please. First, in the 1950s, we have some significant events with desegregation. First, the integration of schools after the court case of Brown versus Board of Education. But we also have really outraging events such as the unfair assassination of Emmett Till. And we have the Freedom Riders, as Angel mentioned, with Rosa Parks, and some of the court cases involved with the unconstitutionality of segregating people by transportation. And this was when the Civil Rights Act was first taking some momentum. Next slide, please. In the 1960s, some of these efforts with civil rights continue with the Freedom Riders, the March to Washington. And as part of this, with a widespread media attention, there was a shift in the general consensus. At the same time, the environmental movement was first starting to gain some attention by understanding the actions of humans have on the environment and their quality of life. This also led to the Stonewall Riots in New York, where trans women of color started advocating for equal treatment within the LGBT community and beyond. This also was the time where Title VI and Title VII were first enacted, and Title VI prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. This also covers employment discrimination, and Title VII prohibits discrimination of employment on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Next slide, please. As we move forward to the 70s, the war was raging and there were a lot of anti-war efforts, but at the same time, we had a lot of coalitions, primarily with women advocating for equal pay, equal rights, and the equal capacity of being part of the workforce and performing any other tasks of society like their male counterparts. We also have anti-war efforts, and one of the examples that we have is the National Chicano Moratorium Committee, which organized to advocate for the disproportionate treatment of Chicano folk in the war without having proper recognition. This was also over 50 years ago, the first time that we had Earth Day, and here we are today celebrating another one, but this one brought about the concern that we as humans have such an important part, and it's important that we all come to decisions understanding that the actions that we take today can have an effect on tomorrow. Next slide, please. In the 1980s, the Environmental Protection Agency, for the first time, erects some policies that increase public role in environmental programs. Women's rights continue to advocate for themselves. This was also the time that LGBTQ groups really raged on to talk about the HIV and AIDS crisis, which kept being disregarded by government and beyond. And also some groups, as you see in the center picture in Wisconsin, were advocating against racist violence in college campuses. Next slide, please. So some policies and legislation that I want to note at the federal level, starting from 1946 all the way to 1977, show how these acts have really started to broaden the range in which the government should start including the public. And some of these are done by requirement. Some of these give guidelines to government agencies to carry out some of this engagement. And as you can see, some of these are part of the Environmental Protection Agency to make sure that the public is involved and is informed in when making these decisions that pertain to their lives and the environment. Next slide, please. A case study that I want to share that is very closely related to the world of urban planning, but also to civic participation and community engagement, took place in Greenwich Village in New York, with Jane Jacobs being a community publicist, and not being a professionally trained planner. She took a battle against Robert Moses, who used to work for the city of New York, in the debate of building a highway through Greenwich Village. This led to the organization of people who resided in Greenwich Village to advocate against it. The basis of this was that the community knew what worked for them better. And even though that you're not professionally trained about a topic, the expertise that you have in the places that you live and the community matters. And thus, this really encouraged a nationwide movement for people to get together to talk about what matters in their community and how can that then subvert government decisions. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you, Angel. I want to dabble on some of the key components for equitable community engagement, which can also call as best practices based on some of the data. So it's important to shift the engagement paradigm, to understand first where we are at, what is the standard practice in the county, in the government, and how we can shift that then. It's important to also have data, to collect baseline data about race, about gender, ethnicity, and how that is intersected across different constituencies, to understand how we can go to communities to be where people are instead of making them come to us, understanding the constraints that this may cause, and being personable, building relationships, having that knowledge of people as they are, and building trust. History matters too, understanding that some communities have intergenerational trauma and distrust can also make us understand why some people might be less likely to participate or interact with government officials. To be flexible means that we might be able to shift some of the decisions in the process to understand that people's perspectives change as we move through a specific decision-making process and beyond. And to establish accountability, as I said before, building that relationship beyond just a government to citizen relationship, but person to person is so important to really foster that active participation that goes beyond just a simple project. Next slide, please. The case study that I want to touch on is in Los Angeles with Vision Zero and the Department of Transportation for LA. So Vision Zero focuses on reducing traffic fatalities by zero for a set date. And they understood that some of the overrepresented communities where people of color resided also were those that had high incidence of fatalities and also were in close proximity to major arterial roads. So what they did was they hired people from the community and they created what is called the street teams. And through training to not only understand the data of traffic crashes and how that then relates to people, they also taught how to communicate and how to create reports. What this also led was through some professional development that not only created long-lasting change in the community by understanding how to better approach traffic and transportation, but also it provided the people who participated in the street teams with some professional development, and also provided them with some financial income. Next slide, please. A local example that I want to touch on too is the Transportation Master Plan and how the inclusive planning efforts really shaped the message and the content of the final product for that remarkable effort as the TMP. At first, they had a steering committee that sought to include people from all different backgrounds, different ages, even different disability status, to understand how they play and how they interact with the transportation landscape, how they move around. And this was sensitive, and they also took into account how these different perspectives also could influence policy and goals for the county in a different way. The surveys were also an additional way to have these folk share their experiences and really say it in a more discreet fashion in their own time and share what mattered most for them about transportation. And lastly, they had community conversations available both in English and Spanish, where people sat down with with familiar faces to really understand what happened in their communities, what their concerns were, and how can government officials meet them where they are. And overall, the people that I have spoken to about the TMP really say that this was a remarkable effort, and it really made a difference across the county in shaping up the future of transportation. Next slide, please. In Rhode Island, there's a small town called Providence, and like many other towns across the United States, there is a uneven distribution and a disproportionate amount of people of color suffering from environmental impacts, especially post-industrial towns having increased air pollution, water pollution, and soil pollution. And the amount of visits for emergency rooms for people of color is much higher, especially for kids under the age of 10. So as part of this process, the communities of Providence came together to really create a public-based system of governance that led to co-creation and collaboration as decisions were made not only in the environment, but also how to improve the quality of life through all decisions made in policy and legislation across the city of Providence. Next slide, please. They developed the Just Providence framework, which establishes some of the key components of achieving sustainability and equity, because they understood clearly that social justice is just as woven in equity and climate change as any other component of living. They also created their own spectrum of community engagement to ownership, in which whenever projects came up and the intent of bringing the public to participate, they had an idea of where they would be at. So they could choose and be very clear and honest about whether they intended to collaborate or simply inform the public. And in consequence, the steering committee that was made by the citizens was able to then share their opinion and feedback. Next slide, please. Some other kind of low-hanging fruits that some governments have done that have been very successful are getting creative with transportation and how you meet communities where they are. So here you see the city of Boston, the city of Dallas, and Durham, North Carolina, having city halls on the go. So I think this would be also a good thing to consider. And as Boulder County, you could have a small truck with several services available to the public, whether they need to pay some fees or they have some questions about city services that they would not be able to achieve, or if they have a big constraint in going into, let's say, downtown, this would be a great way for them to have those services readily available and ask any questions and also build relationships. Next slide, please. Another case that I want to mention that is very important, and I really liked how they carried on this process, was the Durham Beltline and how they created a blueprint for equitable engagement. So similar to Atlanta, Georgia, the city of Durham, North Carolina is intending to have a citywide beltline where people can recreate, walking, biking, or just being outside and exercise. But several communities of color were afraid that this would create gentrification and would increase their property costs, and ultimately they would be excluded from the process and evicted or displaced by gentrification. So what the city did was that from the very beginning, from the planning stages of this process, they invited folks to have community conversations, and they invited them to decide how this process will be carried out, to the point that they even paid some of the community folks to bring their expertise to lead some of these conversations. And as part of this process, in every component, they gave each participant a survey that also allowed them to disaggregate all the information by race, by class, gender, and all these things, so that the city and people making decisions would understand best how certain decisions have different impacts on other people based on their lived experiences. Next slide, please. I know that was a lot to discuss, and it's a lot to digest at once, but it is important for us to really start thinking about how community engagement can make a significant impact moving forward, and how can they build accountability and trust across the entire county. So some of the questions that I have for reflection here are, what are the standard practices for community engagement in Boulder County, and what should they look like? What can decision makers do to foster processes that are inclusive and center racial equity? How do we achieve authentic and transparent citizen power in Boulder County? And how do we connect people to the policy that we're making?
That it, Alberto? So we have till 12, 5 minutes. Any comments from the commissioners or questions?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Commissioner Jones. I was going to give you the first opportunity to speak this time, so we had time. Alberto, thank you. Thank you so much for this. I would love to see if it's possible to maybe all the questions from each section sent back to us as the BOCC, since we won't have time to really have a really needed, healthy, candid, honest brainstorm session. And maybe we can, if my fellow commissioners are interested, set up another time to really dig into that. And so we don't have time to do much more than just, I want to make sure that you all know that I am so appreciative of you taking the time to share this with us. Quite honestly, I wasn't sure what the presentation was. It shows up on our calendar and we don't get a lot of that background a lot of times. And it's been a great conversation starter and a great place for us to start doing some real work and action. I think every presenter asked that question about what action are we able to do together. So thank you.
So can you please stop sharing on the screen so we can see one another? Thank you.
There we go. Dale, did you have any wrap-up comments? This was a lot of really great information, and I know it took a lot of time, a lot of research to put it together, and I just really appreciate what your department has done to package all of this up. And I agree with Marta that there's a lot of food for thought, and I think that we commissioners need to talk about these things together. I don't. It's not going to help anybody for us to get all this information, this history, really thought-provoking questions, and then not actually share and talk with each other about it.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. The wrap up is well, first, thank you for spending 2 hours and taking the time and allowing us to do that. I know how busy your schedules are. But how important this is to you as well. And so I think as an organization, one of the things I appreciate is all the work that we have been doing to kind of further these issues and move forward. I think Marta's idea of getting the questions to you is a great one, so that we can continue the discussion, because there isn't time to have it now, and that's the most important part, is to how do we translate some of these things into operations and actions, so that we can move forward. And even saying that, I think the questions that you might have that we didn't ask yet are really important too. What are your ideas and thoughts as we move forward? Kind of putting those all into that discussion mix is part of this process as we move forward, and we can be more intentional and make better decisions and look at ways to amend the codes or the plans so that we have an equity lens requirement. So, and I know Carrie has her hand up, so I will let her go.
Thanks, Dale, and I appreciate the opportunity to comment. As a Japanese American and member of this community, I just want to express my gratitude for the members of the team here who are presenting, and especially for the courageous conversations that you've begun with yourselves and with your agency. I can't help but reflect that the inequities and history of exclusion that you've invited us to remember today has existed for decades. What feels different to me today is that that a racial equity consciousness has really been awakened in each of you as members of an agency, and I feel like that is so important. As a public servant, I encourage us to each persist in asking what is the community that we imagine, and what's the role of government in creating that community? What's the role of government in righting historic wrongs? And how do our collective beliefs about race and belonging limit our imagination about what's possible? And how can we challenge those beliefs to expand our imaginations? And personally, as an Asian person in the community, I think I need to continue to ask myself, how does my own internalized oppression limit my imagination about the ways in which I belong? And how does my Asian community's generational experience of exclusion limit our sense as a community of empowerment in engagement with government? So thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks to the team too.
Yeah, I second that. Thank you for putting all this together and bringing it to us in the Planning Commission. And, you know, this is a process and this is one step in it. And I really appreciate it. A really good step. And I appreciate Marta's suggestion about the questions as well. More to come. So with that, we are at 12. And so we'll end this presentation, but not the journey along doing this.
Yeah, could I say one more thing? I know we
Sure.
are out of time. I did notice that we had a number of participants or people who joined us just to observe and watch and from the community. And I hope that they got something out of this and found it helpful. And I hope that whatever they glean, they can take back to their own communities and that it'll stimulate conversation in those communities as well.
Good observation. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.